Hello students, today we will be discussing the impact of globalization on regional movements in India with reference to the Telangana movement. The objective behind today's discussion is to give you an understanding and insight into the changing dynamics of regional movements in India pre and post 1990s. Then we would try to understand the nature of the Telangana movement and the response of the government. For the convenience of understanding, the entire discussion is divided into a number of segments. The first issue that would be taken up is Indian federalism and regional movements, and why do regional movements occur. Next, we would move on to impact of neoliberal reforms on regional movements in India. Third, we would move on to the Telangana movement, because the Telangana movement has its roots in the pre-independence years, then it took shape and momentum in the post-independence years, and post-1990s it diverged with a number of issues. Therefore, the Telangana movement is a critical case study to understand the dynamics of the impact of neoliberal reforms on regional movement. Let us first try to understand that what is the impact of globalization on regional movements globally worldwide. The last 2 decades or so have witnessed the acceleration and intensification of the impact of globalization on economic, political, cultural, ideological and environmental aspects of life in the world. Few issues have given rise to more debates than the effects of globalization on the prospect for development in India. Globalization, or what it is called popularly neoliberal reforms in India, has challenged notions of development vis-a-vis regions, identities, citizenship and governance. The protagonist of globalization likened to see in globalization new opportunities for development. The critics look at the subject as producing a kind of development that seemed to underdevelop further the vulnerable segments of the society, and in particular the socially and economically disadvantaged. The question is, why do regional movements occur? Regional imbalance is one of the foremost reasons behind the rise of regional movements in India. Claims for sharing of political power is another reason. Secondly, many of the regions consider themselves to be victims of neglect and discrimination by the parent state government and the political elite, and here Telangana comes in. Many a times reverse discrimination, in the sense that resources are taken from the backward regions for the development of the other regions of the state, giving rise to a number of regional movements. Then, not to forget homeland demands taking place in the different parts of the country. How have globalization impacted regional movements? Regional autonomy movement students are not a new phenomenon in India. The country has witnessed periodic spells of movement since the years following independence, if not before. The movements initially were directed towards the realization of ethnic demands of the different cultural and linguistic communities inhabiting the different regions in the country. Since the 1990s, with the introduction of neoliberal reforms in India, the identity movements acquired a new dimension, with forces of globalization permeating the country and making the regions more conscious of their identity and the need to compete with other areas of the state in order to develop and bring the regional identity issues to the fore. Rather than ethnic factors, the regional movements now revolve around the theme of backwardness. One primary concern is that economic reforms post 1991 have hit the backward regions' common resources of the masses that see the state as indifferent to their plight, and thus have more easily extended support to such movements led by regional elites. India's economic reforms that set in motion after 1991 have led to the onset of new dynamics in the democratic processes that have resulted in the reconfiguration of its politics and economy and changed the notion of regions and identities altogether. The emergence of a more decentralized democracy has led to the sharpening of identities and the line of distinction between well-off and marginalized regions within the same state. The marginalized groups increasingly feel left out, with the central and the state governments in which they live withdrawing from the welfare activities and the market economy, benefiting the already privileged regions of the state at the expense of the backward regions. Post-liberalization, India witnessed rising inequalities between different regions. What is unique is that people of these regions have become quite assertive of their plight, and this has led to competition for resources between regions, with foreign direct investment as the major instrument to take recourse to. As a consequence, the Indian federal debate has registered a marked shift from the center to the regions. And regionalism has become a potent issue, with regions clamoring for more autonomy and increased participation. Movements for the creation of new states are now being garnered on issues of development rather than core identity issues. Thus, we find in the post-1991 era, there has been a renewed emphasis on regions. The agenda for regional development has ignited various forms of states assertion, such as that of Bhojpur to be created out of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, Bodoland of Assam, Bundelkhand out of Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, Kurg out of Karnataka, Harit Pradesh out of Uttar Pradesh, Mahakaushal out of Orissa, Mithilanchal out of Bihar, Muru Pradesh out of Rajasthan, Purvachal out of Uttar Pradesh, to name a few regional movements which have become very assertive of their plight on grounds of underdevelopment and backwardness. Thus, the new base of identity is backwardness in relation to other regions within the state, and hence the renewed emphasis on development. Thus, we find that the emergence of distinct regions is the outcome of specific national, regional and local conditions conjoined with their specific socio-cultural, historical, institutional and political legacies. Andhra Pradesh, one of the largest states of India, was formed in 1956 by merging three areas: Telangana, Coastal Andhra and Rayalaseema. The Telangana region occupies the largest geographical area of the state, 42%, followed by Coastal Andhra occupying 34% and Rayalaseema occupying 25%. Now, let us try to understand the movement of Telangana and the emphasis from a region to a state. The state of Telangana was formed on 2nd June 2014 as the 29th state of India by carving 10 out of 23 districts of undivided Andhra Pradesh. The States Reorganization Commission, appointed by the centre on December 22, 1953, conditionally recommended a separate Telangana state on consideration of, among others, its economic backwardness and different political and historical experiences under the Nizam rule. Therefore, students, please note that the SRC had already recommended a separate state of Telangana on the ground of backwardness, but that recommendation was not accepted. Let us move on to the detailed understanding of the Telangana movement. The genesis of the Telangana movement can be traced to the 1950s, when the entire country was rocked by a number of movements specifically for the creation of linguistic states. It is specifically linked to the Andhra movement, where the political leaders were divided between the twin concerns of the formation of Vishalandhra or the two separate states of Andhra and Telangana. With the movement for recognition of linguistic states gathering momentum, the demand for the recognition of the legitimate rights of the people of the Telangana region also took a new course. In 1953, based on the recommendations of the States Reorganization Commission, the Telugu-speaking areas of the former Madras state were separated to form Andhra, the country's first linguistic province. The States Reorganization Commission, which was set up to examine the question of reorganization of states in the entire country, was in fact not in favor of merging the Telangana region with the state of Andhra and creation of Vishal Andhra. In this context, the SRC notes that it will be in the interest of Andhra as well as Telangana if not for the present. The Telangana area is constituted into a separate state which may be known as the Hyderabad state. Let us move on to the major milestones in the Telangana movement. The demand for a separate Telangana gained momentum early in 1954 when two influential Congress leaders K.V. Rangareddy and M. Chenna Reddy lent their support. Yet it soon became muted by the winter of 1955 when the proponents of Vishal Andhra, Greater Andhra, outvoted this in the Hyderabad Assembly. This brought into relief the SRC's recommendation that Telangana be merged with coastal Andhra and Rayalaseema only if two-thirds members of the residual Hyderabad State Assembly would resolve to do so. The merger was expedited after the chief ministers of Hyderabad and Andhra agreed to form a united Andhra Pradesh in 1955, which was officially endorsed by 8 political leaders from across the regions on February 20, 1956 in what is famously known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Now, what is the Gentleman's Agreement? The Gentleman's Agreement envisions a power-sharing agreement. This agreement provided for a 20-member regional council for Telangana. It also said that a distribution of cabinet portfolios wherein the proportion of members of Andhra and Telangana was respectively fixed at 60% and 40%. Moreover, if the post of the CM was allotted to a person from Andhra, including Rayalaseema, the deputy CM would come from Telangana. Two key cabinet portfolios chosen from Home, Finance, Revenue, Planning and Development and Commerce and Industry portfolios would be assigned to ministers from Telangana. The Gentleman's Agreement also provided that the surplus income of Telangana after deducting its proportional share in the state's expenditure on central and general administration would be earmarked for Telangana's development expenditure. Apart from these, favorable and protective service conditions were inter alia provided by laying down 12 years of domiciliary requirements for employment in government services in Telangana. Now, it is imperative to understand that though the Gentleman's Agreement provided for a sharing of resources, sharing of cabinet portfolios between the legislative members belonging to the Andhra and Telangana region, however, not much was achieved. Please note, students, that a number of factors actually played an important role in the Telangana movement. We should not lose sight of the caste politics in Andhra, the Mulki rules, the Andhra versus Telangana debate, and most importantly, the livelihood issues surrounding the people of Telangana. Let us try to understand caste politics and how it played a role in the Telangana movement. The Gentleman's Agreement provided an expansive yet weak power sharing framework and it was not observed in practice. So, Gentleman's Agreement was just a theoretical understanding devoid of any practical utility and the Telangana people did not get much share in the power sharing arrangement. Moreover, please understand that the Kammas and Reddys succeeded in transforming their economic dominance into control of political power after Andhra Pradesh was created. Given that the Kammas and Reddys combined consistently accounted for about 10% of undivided Andhra Pradesh's population, their monopoly of economic and political power was largely perceived to cater to an exclusionary and discriminatory regime. This popular perception was also largely responsible as large segments of the educated middle class which emerged across castes both forward as well as backward in Andhra Pradesh could no longer be accommodated in the old patrimonial system following the expansion of modern education. So, here we note that caste politics plays an important role in fomenting the Telangana movement. Added to this was the age-old Mulki rules. Now, what are those Mulki rules? The persistent Mulki rules controversy fueled fire to the long-standing grievances and a sense of insecurity of the people of Telangana who felt that their co-linguistic counterparts in the region of Andhra were benefiting more than them. Originally framed by the Nizam of Hyderabad in 1919, the Mulki rules were farmans or decrees given to the Mulkis. Mulki refers to local residents who fulfill the minimum domiciliary requirements of 15 years in Hyderabad, favorable access to subordinate civil services. The controversy surrounding Mulki rules was confounded. Allegations of serious irregularities committed by the state in issuing bogus Mulki certificates to the people belonging to the Andhra region who got secure jobs in Telangana, wherein many people who should have been getting jobs from the Telangana region were denied jobs because of these bogus Mulki certificates. Thus, what happened was that the Telangana youths lost out on the much deserved employment opportunities, and this ignited a sense of frustration among the people. Let's come to the next issue, the debate between Andhra versus Telangana. The Telangana people argued that language and culture are distinctive from their coastal Andhra counterparts, especially given that the fact that the former's language and culture have an indelible influence of Urdu language and Persian, including the food, dress, way of life, etc., which were entrenched by the Nizam rulers during the 18th and the 19th century. Unlike their counterparts in coastal Andhra and Rayalaseema, who were highly influenced by the British. Thus, we find that this was a cultural divide. The Nizam's influence on Telangana and the British influence on Andhra and Rayalaseema. The formation of Telangana was seen as a fruit that would help the Telangana people overcome this cultural, economic, linguistic and political marginalization. Moreover, the benefits of liberalization could be reaped more easily by states and regions with higher levels of literacy, education, health and infrastructure. And definitely here, the Andhra region was much forward than the Telangana region. Another interesting fact is the Telugu film industry. The control of the film industry and infrastructure like airports, highways, flyovers, malls and residential complexes by Andhra capitalists reinforced the overwhelming sense of Telangana being relegated to an internal colony. Because there was another important factor which should be noted here about how the Telugu industry worked. Now, comic characters in the Telugu films with their rustic and broken language were mostly drawn from the Telangana region. It was conveniently used not only to reinforce their cultural backwardness, but also their marginal role in the Telugu society. Coming to the next important issue, livelihood issues, and the foremost here comes in agriculture. The people of the rural districts of Telangana, excluding Hyderabad, are solely dependent on agriculture and water for their livelihood. The majority of the Telangana population comprises of agricultural farmers whose livelihood revolves around the yearly produce from their lands, for which they are heavily dependent on government for subsidy in fertilizer and irrigation facilities. Some of the reform policies introduced by the government post-1990s led to deterioration of the condition of the poor farmers, withdrawal of subsidies, support prices, privatization, simultaneously increase in power tariff, leading to inconvenience to these government-dependent farmers. Development policies have catered to the elite agribusiness class to the utter discontent of the millions of rural farmers inhabiting in Telangana. With the withdrawal of state subsidies on fertilizers, seeds and other inputs, the cost of cultivation went up drastically. To supplement for the losses incurred, the farmers took up to growing commercial crops and multi-cropping system, and these cropping system was highly water intensive. Thus, the poor farmers became heavily dependent on bore wells and other means of artificial water supply, which were extremely expensive and sometimes beyond the reach of the poor farmers, for which they had to take loans, which increased their debts, and they were unable to pay off their debts and many a times contributed to farmers' suicides. The neoliberal reforms led to open competition with the well-off agribusiness class and the multinational corporations interested in land acquisition for reaping high benefits. The next issue is industrial development. The new model of development introduced by the Indian state since the 1990s led to massive migration of laborers who were displaced as a result of land acquisition by the Special Economic Zones Act of 2005. Coupled with this is the state's withdrawal from education and health services and giving it into the hands of private service providers. This is one of the reasons why the main participants of the Telangana movement are the youth and the unemployed who have been displaced from all economic opportunities in the Telangana region. Despite several promises made by political parties and representatives, the progress in the region in terms of job creation has been low, which is starkly visible in terms of FDI. The state of Andhra Pradesh attracted 124 billion rupees of FDI between 1991 and 2010, of which 51% was invested in Telangana, but with a very high concentration in Hyderabad city. The Telangana region, excluding Hyderabad, received only a meager 13% compared to 43.2% investment in coastal Andhra Pradesh. Thus, the Telangana region suffered massively as a result of introduction of neoliberal reforms. Now, this model of development has led to widening of inequalities across the different classes, rural, urban and forward as well as the backward regions. It has also led to widening of inequalities, and it is these widening inequalities within the state, within the elites as well as the forward and marginalized segments, that the new political forces started to reap benefits of them. Now, this stark division between the forward and the backward regions have led to a renewed emphasis for the creation of a state of Telangana. The revival of the Telangana movement, please note students, is a direct fallout of this path of development. Thus, the movement, instead of couched with ethno-identity issues, has now thrown open questions of equity, power, development, quite distinct from the Jai Telangana movement of the 1950s. Thus, it seems that the Telangana movement has actually subdued ethnic concerns and have highlighted concerns of economic development as well as education and employment opportunities for the youth of Telangana. Now, who provided leadership to the Telangana movement? New issues of leadership in the movement developed since the 1991. This period of 1990s also coincided with the formation of coalition governments in India, and here regional parties started playing a major role not only in central coalition but also offering leadership in the Telangana movement. Unlike the earlier statehood movement where leadership was provided by the Indian National Congress, in the recent movement since the 1990s, the rise of regional political parties and various forums have played a very important role in putting forth the demands of the Telangana movement. This, however, does not mean that the national parties are indifferent or oppose the cause of new statehood demands. The leadership of the new Telangana movement since the 1990s was taken up by the Telangana Rashtra Samiti, which was formed in 2001 under the leadership of KKR, K. Chandrasekhar Rao, whose single most agenda was the formation of a separate state of Telangana out of Andhra. To realize his political objective, KCR entered into an electoral alliance with the Congress-led UPA at the centre in 2004. Although UPA listed the formation of Telangana in the electoral manifesto of the Common Minimum Programme, however, it did not vigorously pursue the formation of a separate state except prevailing upon the President of India to formally announce that the formation of the state of Telangana would be considered in appropriate time. KCR deserted UPA as a result and entered into an electoral alliance with TDP and the left parties in 2008. When he found that these parties were also not helpful either, he subsequently switched alliance and went and joined to the National Democratic Alliance after 2009 Andhra Pradesh Assembly elections. Unfortunately, the NDA did not come to power in 2009, which meant that the KCR's electoral calculation did not pay off. Yet, Telangana Rashtra Samiti, along with various social movements, succeeded in catapulting Telangana into the limelight of federal electoral calculations and exerted tremendous pressure on political parties to expedite the creation of Telangana. New Delhi's decision to create Telangana in 2014 under Article 3 of the Indian Constitution caters to the long-standing demand of the creation of a separate state of Telangana. The UPA government in 2014 assented to the creation of a separate state of Telangana. However, please note that such a unilateral move would have been unimaginable in conventional federal states like the United States, wherein territorial boundaries of constituent states are considered inviolable unless the latter concur with the federal government to resize or remap. This is not the case in India, where Article 3 allows for internal reorganization. What are the lessons that we can learn from Telangana? After 6 decades of intermittent struggle, the state of Telangana was formed in 2014 as the 29th state of the country. Since 1990s, new identity issues seem to divide linguistic groups into divergent and conflicting regional groups joined by multilinguistic cultural communities having a stake in the region. So, ethnic cultural factors have taken a backseat with developmental priorities gaining ground. Interestingly, while the 1950s and 60s language united identities, 1990s saw cultural identity not as an integrating force but is circumscribed by concerns of development and deprivation. The pertinent point is that the Telangana movement significantly focuses on the fact that the same language which united people of Andhra in 1950s and 60s have divided them in terms of region and development issues. Thus, students, the impact of globalization on regional movements have been all pervasive, and the shift has been from ethnic issues to developmental issues. Thank you.